This is Benin, 1897. The world was evolving not by choice but by force. Across the continent, kings were falling. Frontiers were being redrawn, not with ink, but with gunpowder. Empires were collapsing, not with ceremony but with fire. But deep in the tropical forests of the Niger Delta, one kingdom still stood unbowed, sovereign, sacred, and strong. This was the Kingdom of Benin. For over 500 years, it defied bullets, greed, and treaties. Built on bronze, blood, and divine order, Benin had refused to bend to British ambition. While the colonial map of Africa expanded like a dark tide, the Oba of Benin ruled firm with no concessions, no compromises. But in January 1897, everything changed. It began with an ambush near the village of Ugbine. A British delegation, advancing toward the city in violation of sacred laws, was wiped out. To the British, it was a massacre. To Benin, it was a defense of sovereignty. And so the empire struck back, not with diplomacy, but with rage. This is the untold story of how one of Africa's greatest civilizations was brought to its knees, looted, and exiled not for crime, but for defiance. Long before European powers arrived on West Africa's shores, the Kingdom of Benin had already built a legacy of wealth, governance, and art that rivaled many in the world. Benin City, the capital, was renowned across Europe for its broad boulevards, massive earthworks, and intricate bronze artistry. European travelers in the 17th century described a city with streets wider and straighter than those in Amsterdam, and moats that rivaled those of ancient Rome. At the center of this civilization stood the Oba, not just a king, but a divine figure, the spiritual head of the empire and a sacred link between the people and their gods. By 1888, that role was held by Oba Ovonramwen Nogbaisi. He presided over a society governed by strict order, structured around powerful palace societies like the Uzama and the Iwebo, and supported by guilds of bronze casters, ivory carvers, and warrior elites. The Oba's word was law. Foreigners could only enter the city with royal permission. Trade was regulated. The kingdom was closed to free European access, and deliberately so. Benin had traded with Europe since the Portuguese arrived in the 15th century. But it had always done so on its own terms. By the late 19th century, those terms had become intolerable to the British. The British were no longer traders, they were empire builders. By the 1890s, the Royal Niger Company and British colonial officials were expanding aggressively across the Niger Delta. Where diplomacy failed, they used force. And Benin, with its refusal to sign treaties or surrender trade rights, became a growing obstacle. In 1892, Vice-Consul Henry Galway attempted to persuade the Oba to sign a treaty of protection, one that would have handed the British control over trade and territory. The Oba refused. Instead, he restricted British movement, tightened trade policies, and doubled down on the kingdom's sovereignty. To the British, Benin had become hostile, a term that in imperial vocabulary meant target. Among those pushing hardest for Benin's subjugation was James Robert Phillips, the acting consul general. In November 1896, Phillips requested permission from London to depose the Oba. But instead of waiting for approval, he launched a so-called diplomatic mission, one that included 9 British officers and around 250 African troops and carriers. They set out for Benin, knowing full well that the Oba had warned against visitors during the Igwe festival, a sacred period during which the kingdom closed itself off for rituals. What they walked into was not diplomacy, it was a war. On January 4, 1897, near the village of Ugbine, Benin warriors struck. The Oba's chiefs, learning of the advancing force during a forbidden time, interpreted it as a deliberate provocation and possibly an armed invasion. Benin's elite warriors, known for their discipline and lethal tactics, ambushed them in the forest. Phillips and most of his entourage were killed. Only 2 Europeans, Captain Alan Boyce-Regan and District Commissioner Locke, escaped, fleeing through dense jungle back to the coast. In London, the press called it a massacre. The Colonial Office called it treason. The military called it a national insult. But behind the outrage, the British saw an opportunity. Benin had handed them a reason to invade. Now they would retaliate, not to restore peace, but to destroy a kingdom. On February 9, 1897, the British launched the Punitive Expedition, a military campaign designed not just to punish, but to erase. The invasion was led by Rear Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, a seasoned officer with colonial warfare experience. His force included over 1,200 men, including Royal Marines, African auxiliaries, and Hausa troops trained by the British. Maxim machine guns, 7-pounder artillery, rocket launchers, and modern rifles. Engineers, sappers, and medics not just to conquer, but to occupy. The troops landed at Guado and began their march toward Benin City, attacking villages along the way including Ugbine and Sapoba, burning homes, killing civilians, and seizing anything of value. Meanwhile, in Benin, the Oba and his court made what preparations they could. Shrines were sealed, warriors were mobilized, sacred objects were hidden, but the kingdom was not ready for modern war. They had no artillery, no machine guns, only bravery and belief. By February 17, after more than a week of fighting, British forces reached the gates of Benin City. The once mighty walls, part of a defensive earthwork system that stretched for over 16,000 kilometers, one of the largest in the world, stood silent. Many defenders had already fallen. Others retreated into the forests. The Oba, advised by his chiefs, had fled the city days earlier. The British found the city largely deserted. What followed was systematic looting and destruction. Temples, palaces, and homes were burned. Royal altars were desecrated. And most infamously, the Benin Bronzes. Thousands of intricately carved bronze plaques, heads, masks, and ivory sculptures were seized. These were not mere decorations, they were records, documents of the kingdom's history, lineages, laws, and spirituality. Some were shipped to London to offset the costs of the expedition. Others were sold to museums in Berlin, Paris, and Boston. By the time the fires died down, Benin City was in ruins. The heart of a 5-century-old civilization had been gutted in 9 days. Oba Ovonramwen, still hiding deep in the Edo forests, knew the kingdom had fallen. His city had burned. His people were scattered. But he refused to surrender immediately. For 6 months, he evaded capture, moving from village to village, under the protection of loyal chiefs. Eventually, on August 5, 1897, he chose to surrender not for himself, but to protect his people from further violence. He was promised safety in exchange for peace. When he appeared before British officials in Calabar, he wore the full regalia of an Oba, coral beads, white robes, and a royal staff standing tall even in defeat. But his monarchy was over. In 1899, Oba Ovonramwen was formally exiled. He would live the rest of his life in Calabar under colonial supervision. He died in January 1914, just months before the British formally created Nigeria, a colonial state built atop the bones of kingdoms like Benin. The British justified their actions as retaliation, a punitive response to barbarism. But the looting of Benin was far more than military revenge. It was cultural theft. Over 3,000 artifacts, bronzes, ivory masks, coral crowns, were removed. Many remain in European museums to this day. Benin's loss was not just territorial, it was spiritual. Generations of Edo children grew up disconnected from the very bronzes that told their story. Bronzes now locked in glass displays in London and Berlin. But Benin did not vanish. In 1914, the monarchy was restored in ceremonial form under Oba Weka II, son of Ovonramwen. Though stripped of political power, the throne remained sacred. Artisans rebuilt guilds, oral historians preserved memory. The legacy of Benin endured. In the 21st century, a new war has begun not with bullets, but with diplomacy. Nigerian activists, historians, and artists are demanding the return of the Benin Bronzes. Museums that once ignored the theft now face public pressure. In 2021, Germany agreed to return over 1,100 bronzes to Nigeria. The Edo Museum of West African Art is being built to house them in Benin City. But the battle is far from over. The British Museum, which holds over 900 Benin artifacts, still refuses full repatriation. The struggle continues not just for objects, but for memory. Because this was never just a war for territory, it was a war for the soul of a people. They said it was revenge for a few dead British officers, but they erased an entire civilization. The Kingdom of Benin was not conquered by savagery, it was destroyed by ambition. And yet, its legacy survives, in bronze, in memory, and in resistance. Oba Ovonramwen died in exile, but the Oba still reigns. And today, the stolen bronzes still whisper truths the empire tried to bury. This is not just a story of the past, this is Africa's heritage and truth. Like this video if you want to learn more about Africa's history. Drop a comment. Should the Benin Bronzes be returned? Subscribe to Lost History for more African history.